Plenty of seats over here. Thank you. Thanks so much. Steve, where are your red and white tennis shoes? Have you seen his?
Yes, he just showed them to me. There's no game today, so we're waterproof. I had my red ones on yesterday.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So for those of you who were here yesterday, you would have learned from Imam Antepli that he would not be able to be here this morning because he had to fly back to Durham last night because there was a bomb threat on campus, and the major stakeholders were asked to attend a meeting with the president of the university at Duke, and so he was so very sorry that he could not be here for this last session. He could not speak more gratefully about how he was received here and embraced and welcomed by all of you. And he's very regretful for not being able to be here this morning. But we know that he's where he needs to be, and hopefully the situation on the Duke campus will get much better than it is now. But we still have Rabbi Salkin, and you know, this is a great example of when you have lemons, you can make some really great lemonade. And Rabbi Salkin's going to do that this morning as he's pivoting to talk about where the Jewish community, where the Jewish people, Judaism may or may not go post October 7th. So, Rabbi Salkin.
I want to thank Rabbi Herber for his graciousness and his friendship that has spanned several decades. And I want to thank all of you for having invited me and Abdullah to visit with you this weekend. I know that he regretted having to go back, but it was nothing short of a campus emergency in these difficult times that propelled him back to Durham, North Carolina. It's been a wonderful weekend. Abdullah and I did not really know what to expect. We've done this several times. Each time we've done it, it has been very different. The last time we did it, we were at the major Episcopal Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, doing it as a three-way, Jewish, Christian, and Muslims together. So this was slightly different. Your receptivity, your openness, of course, your graciousness, really, it was wonderful. Ashreinu matov chelkenu, how happy we are and how good is our portion. In pivoting on this Sunday morning, I want to share with you something that I just wrote, and there's a story to it. My new book will be coming out at the end of January. It's called Tikkun Ha'am, Repairing Our People, and the subtitle, which was just chosen by the publisher, is Israel and the Crisis in Liberal Judaism. It is a book that speaks lovingly and critically of certain trends that are happening in non-Orthodox Judaism in North America, why those trends are problematic, and what we can do to turn those trends around. But the story that I share with you is that the book was ready to go into print, and then came October 7th. And I realized on October 8th, not that the book was irrelevant, but that the introduction I had written was completely and totally not unnecessary, but was no longer as relevant as it needed to be. And I sat down and I rewrote the introduction. I'd like to share that with you today. You will be the first people to have heard it out loud, and your feedback will, of course, be very important. Not that I can do anything about it at this time. It's now in print, but I do hope that you'll all be able to go on Amazon under Jeffrey Salkin and pre-order the book. It's being published by Wicked Sun Publishing, which is an interesting name for a publishing house. And it's also print on demand, which basically means that you can order the book and it will show up on your Kindle. So it's a very, at least environmentally friendly way of doing books. What I want to share with you is simply this. I don't know that I am the first person to say this, and I certainly am not the last person. October 7th was a Control-Alt-Delete on the hard drive of the American Jewish soul. A Control-Alt-Delete. And on that horrific day, the worst day in Jewish history since the end of the Shoah, our people experienced what can only be referred to as a reboot and a re-understanding of who we are. Now, everything I say is from the vantage point of now the Shloshim, the 30-day period, 30 days after the horror. But I want to go one step further and say that what I say is tentative. I think it is true. We cannot know how true it will be. More than ever before, American Jews understand the centrality of Israel and Zionism to the Jewish people. I think in the last month or so, there have been many people who were previously lukewarm or apathetic about Israel who became full-blown Jewish patriots. You'll recall that in the days after the horror, there are various landmarks all over the world that were lit up in blue and white, the colors of Israel. Ironically, one of the landmarks that was illuminated in blue and white was the Arch of Titus in Rome, which had initially been constructed as a way of taunting the Jewish exiles who had been deported there after the Romans destroyed Judea in the year 70. There's been unprecedented giving to Israel through Jewish federations and various organizations. We were discussing Park Avenue Synagogue earlier. In New York City, Park Avenue Synagogue raised more than $18 million for Israel in just several days. More than ever before, American Jews feel that they are part of a people. Peoplehood has gone into the center of our consciousness. There is that perennial debate. Are Jews a religious group, an ethnic group, a national group, or a culture? The answer to that question is yes. All. October 7th has at least temporarily set aside the typical divisions of Jews into affiliated, unaffiliated, religious, secular, reform, conservative, reconstructionist, various flavors of orthodoxy, renewal, culturally Jewish, or just Jewish. It no longer seems to matter. And that is because the heart of the Jewish people has never been more broken, and paradoxically, the Jewish people has never been more whole. I cannot begin to tell you how many times in the last few weeks people have asked me, do you have any family members who have been affected by what is happening? And my response, and I offer it to you as a good snarky response, is yes, all of them. They are all my family members, every single one of them. I have often said, as Jewish people, we are a small people, but we are a large family. And this crisis has driven that home in ways that many previously unconnected Jews could never have imagined. More than ever before, American Jews are trying to discern the balance between universal ideas, in which we care for all people, and particular ideas in which we care for the Jewish people. There's that famous mantra from Pirkei Avot, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? There are days where I notice the order in which that comes. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? That's particularism. If I'm only for myself, what am I? That is universalism. And there have been times where I have imagined that those two phrases were uttered not one after the other, but actually, impossibly, simultaneously, that they are both simultaneously true. But I believe that what has happened in the last few weeks has been at least a temporary shifting of the moral weight of those commitments. We American Jews still passionately believe in our universal social justice commitments. But in the short term, something has happened. I encounter many Jews now who are circling their emotional wagons, and they are saying to themselves and others, well, yes, of course, I care about the innocent civilians in Gaza who will suffer, and my heart breaks for them. And theoretically and spiritually, compassion is not a limited human utility. But my people is bleeding. I wish I had unlimited emotional strength and time, but I don't have that unlimited strength. At this time, I must focus on my own people's incalculable losses. Like never before, and more than ever before, American Jews are encountering increased anti-Semitism, and we are understanding it more deeply. As I've said several times to friends and colleagues, we lack the vocabulary for what we are now experiencing. We have never experienced this before in American history. You see, one of the issues that we're dealing with now, and I think this strikes many of us Jews who are left of center, who are classic liberals, or might even be progressives, is that we told ourselves a story that violent anti-Semitism would only and has only come from the right. That would be the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. In 2018, the attack on Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh, which was the single worst day in American Jewish history. The attack on a Chabad synagogue in Poway, California in 2019. All of those attacks came from the right. And then there were other attacks that did not neatly fit into a right-wing, left-wing dichotomy. The attack on the kosher supermarket in Jersey City in 2019, the Hanukkah attack on a rabbi in Monsey, New York, also in 2019. But in the several weeks after the Hamas attack on Israel, there was a 400% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. And if there have not been blatantly violent anti-Semitic attacks, then the attacks have surely been verbal and ideological. And what we've encountered is something that we never expected, but that we should have expected, and that most of those attacks have been in the form of anti-Israel sentiment, and most of those attacks have come from the left. We did not expect this. We should have expected it. And I believe that when my younger friends, colleagues, and relatives are shocked by this, they're only shocked by this because they have the misfortune of being born so late. I left the left exactly 50 years ago, almost to this day. I left the left as a college sophomore when, in the weeks after the Yom Kippur War, I saw fellow students rationalizing the attacks and professors doing the same thing. In one class that I attended, the professor actually said, quote, "And as you all know, Theodor Herzl negotiated with Hitler." I raised my hand. Already then I was shy. And I said to him, "About what?" Herzl died in 1904. Hitler was born in 1889. Adolf Hitler was 15 years old when Herzl died. Now, theoretically, it is possible that the two of them might have met on the streets in Vienna. The professor said, "Well, something like that." In the words of Jonathan Chait, "It is often the case that a movement's treatment of Jews serves as a broader indicator of its health. It is not an accident that the Republican Party has become more attractive to anti-Semites as it has grown more paranoid and authoritarian. What the far left revealed about its disposition toward Jews is not just a warning for the Jews, but a warning for all progressives who care about democracy and humanity. The pro-Hamas left is not merely indicating an indifference toward Jews. It is revealing the illiberal left's inherent cruelty, repression, and inhumanity. The onslaught from Hamas, the ghoulish nature of it, has proven once again that Israel is up against people who have no liberal wish list for the Jewish state. I want to be very clear, something that you might have discerned from earlier conversations. If you say to me that there are certain policies and positions that the State of Israel takes, my response to you might be, get in line. Rabbi Herber and I were both at the demonstrations in Jerusalem this summer against judicial reform, protesting the presence of avowed racists in the government. That seems like such a long time ago. Such a long time ago. But it is clear that we are up against people. I want you to be very, very, very certain that you understand this, who do not want a better Israel. They want no Israel. It is time for us to understand the real meaning of that catchphrase, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. You'd be astounded to know how many people have no idea what the river is and what the sea is. As I've said several times in print and to others, that is a code word for the disappearance of the State of Israel. It wants a Judenrein Eretz Yisrael. And as far as I can tell, I'm not the smartest person in the room, there are only three ways that the Jews leave Israel in that scenario: on planes, on ships, and in body bags. Neither of those, none of those are acceptable, and I cannot get my mind around any of them. It is time for us to be unafraid and to call this out for what it is. The masks are off, the gloves are off. I do not even want to give this the pseudo-scientific, polite term of anti-Semitism, a term that was invented by an anti-Semite. Let's call it what it is: Jew hatred. This is Jew hatred. And that brings me to another but very sad point. What is happening now is not only a reassessment of our political alliances, not only a reshuffling of the balance between universalism and particularism, not only a highlighting of Jewish peoplehood, not only a highlighting of Israel and Zionism in American Jewish consciousness. But what Rabbi Herber and Imam Entepli and I have been talking about over the past 48 hours is that this will be bringing us, American Jews, to a critical thought process about the meaning of the university. As I said yesterday, the higher the tuition bill, the more likely it will be that your kid will come back from college or your grandchild will come back from college for Thanksgiving, parroting such fad concepts as postmodernism, deconstructionism, colonialist theory, and the narrative. They might have stood by embarrassed into silence as their classmates or professors embraced the actions of Hamas, or justified those actions, or excused those actions, or relativized those actions, or piled accusations onto Israel in a grisly game of whataboutism. For almost 1,000 years, starting in Western Europe, Jews have put their faith in the university. We have put our faith in higher education, in rationality, and in intellectualism. We saw universities as temples of enlightenment. Jews have held that ticket in their hands as their ticket into the world. But I dare say, since October 7th, many of us, and those of us who've been paying attention, have come to feel betrayed, and for good reason. What we have seen is a failure on the part of the Academy to bring their students into a higher form of moral reasoning. Now, let me be very clear. As Zeke Emanuel wrote in the New York Times just several weeks ago, we in the Academy need to look more deeply at how it is possible that so many undergraduates, graduate students, law students, and faculty at our nation's finest colleges and universities could have such moral blinders. Colleges and universities need to be more self-critical and rethink what it means for students to be educated. For the last 50 years, with a few exceptions, higher education has been reducing requirements. At the same time, academia has become more hesitant. We often avoid challenging our students, avoid putting hard questions to them, avoid forcing them to articulate and justify their opinions. All opinions are equally valid, we argue. We are fearful of offending them. I have no sympathy for the student, and there will be others, who had a job offer at a law firm rescinded, and because of that person's public support of Hamas. Just days ago, a number of prestigious law firms wrote an open letter to the universities saying they would not accept candidates who themselves applauded Hamas. And lest you say this is just cancel culture coming back to bite them, I want you to be very clear about what's going on here. There's a subtlety here, there's a nuance here. No one is not getting a job. No one is failing to achieve a particular academic setting, standing, or professional acquisition because of a political opinion. Their failure is because of a failure to exercise moral reasoning. They flunk. And there is a price to be paid. Already, Jewish donors are pulling money from universities. My own son is a graduate of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Les and Abigail Wexner, major prominent philanthropists, they broke their ties with Harvard over the university's inadequate initial responses to Hamas terror. And what I think is going to happen is what is already starting to happen. There will be new universities that will be created. Already, there is an institution, the University of Austin, which is being created that will have probably a slightly more conservative bent than many of us are comfortable with. It will return back to a classic curriculum and an understanding that is the role of the university, not only to impart knowledge, but also to impart wisdom. As part of that conversation, I am hoping that this will lead to another educational reform, and that is a reinvigoration of Jewish teen education. Let us imagine a young Jewish student, Ben. Graduates from high school, he goes to college. During his first week on campus, his suite mates find out that he is Jewish, and they berate him for being a supporter of an apartheid regime that is committing genocide against the Palestinians. And in the classrooms, his professors are saying the same things. Several years ago on Rosh Hashanah, I preached these words. This past month on college campuses all across the country, SUVs pulled up to the dorms and hundreds of thousands of young Jews climbed out. They found their dorm rooms, they met their roommates, they began unpacking their duffel bags, they went to orientation. And over the course of the next few months, many of them will find themselves in the middle of a war. The soldiers in that war do not use guns. The soldiers in that war do not use tanks. The soldiers in that war use ideas, and they use words. It is a war against Israel, against the very idea of Israel. It is an international war, and our young people will meet that war, and they will have to respond to that war. A Jewish student wrote these words at that time. Over the course of an hour, she writes, my history was denied, the murder of my people was justified, and a movement whose sole purpose is the destruction of the Jewish homeland was glorified. Statements were made justifying the ruthless murder of innocent Israeli civilians, blatantly denying that Jews were native to the land of Israel, and denying the Holocaust in which 6 million Jews were murdered. Why anyone in their right mind would accept these slanders as truths baffles me, but they did. Now comes the pathetic truth. Those students are helpless to respond. They simply cannot. Professor Rachel Fish puts it this way. These are students, unfortunately, who have parents who don't know how to help them. They themselves don't have the language. They don't have the substantive knowledge. They didn't prepare their students to walk through the world with a tall, strong spine. The grown-ups failed them on multiple fronts. The university as a marketplace of ideas failed them. How do you ensure that the next generation of Jews maintain that hatikva, that hope, in order to remain committed to the Jewish people? Her words stick in my brain. The grown-ups failed them on multiple fronts. Their parents failed them. Their parents failed to keep them in Jewish education or any kind of Jewish intellectual, social, or spiritual context beyond the singing of Adon Olam on Shabbat morning and beyond puberty. And that has meant, and I say this as my own failure, that we have sent at least 2 or 3 generations of Jewish kids to college without their vaccinations. Without their vaccinations. We kicked the can down the road. We assumed that Ramah would be enough, yes, for the percentage of kids who are there. It is helpful, but not as helpful as it needs to be, given the challenge. We kick the can down the road. Oh, they'll go on birthright. Too little, too late. Every study has shown that there is an erosion in Jewish education in the teen years. Of 24 communities surveyed between 1993 and 2010, over half reported less than 50% of their children continued beyond bar or bat mitzvah education. In fact, most Jewish adults over the age of 40 have no Jewish education beyond 7th grade. Now, I could get into the weeds here and be very self-critical about what synagogues are doing and not doing, but I want to get to hope. Hatikva. I want to bring you back to an earlier crisis in world Jewry and what happened. I believe that there is a precedent for a renewal, rejuvenation, and renaissance in American Judaism that this catastrophe places before us. And I can say that for several reasons. I can say that, and I do not have time to drag you through the history, but I will say this. After every catastrophe of Jewish history, there was Jewish spiritual renewal. After the Judeans were sent into exile in Babylon, they and the survivors of the earlier exile on the part of the Assyrians, of the kingdom of Israel, the scattering around the nations, they created the Torah as we know it. The Torah as we know it was produced by refugees in exile. Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism of the Mishnah and of the prayer book itself, was the creation of the survivors after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, was the creation of survivors of the exile from Spain in 1492 who were in Tzfat. Hasidism, that great explosion of the Jewish spirit, was the creation of survivors of the pogroms in 1648, 1649, and 1650. Modern Jewish theology is the result of modern Jewish thinkers looking at the reality of the Shoah. After every catastrophe, we found new strength. There's a Hasidic saying that says, if you want to find a spark, you got to go through the ashes. And that's what we've always done. But specifically, I want to bring you back to June 1967, to the Six-Day War. To date myself, that was my bar mitzvah year. I think it's possible to view modern American Jewish history as falling into 2 eras, pre-67 and post-67. Before the Six-Day War, American Judaism was rather lackluster. It was parv. Our grandparents returned from World War II. They built suburban synagogues, and those synagogues were full of people, but to be honest, they were simultaneously empty of the spirit. There was a kind of spiritual anorexia that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel often described in his writings. To be fair, and not to be cruel, when he complained about vacuous worship in the 1950s, he was mostly talking about conservative synagogues. That was his home base. But let me be the first to tell you, he would have found it no better in Reform synagogues, or in any synagogue for that matter. But then comes June 1967, the Six-Day War, and the result of that was a realization on the part of American Jews that we had not known how deeply Jewish we were. What got better after 67? Jewish education got better. For those of you who are of a certain age, you might remember that if you attended religious school, Cheder, Talmud Torah, in the 1940s, the 1950s, you have horror stories. Everyone has horror stories about teachers who were mostly men. Many of them were survivors, or they were angry, bitter refugees. There were terrible or non-existent educational materials. Teachers hit their kids. There was rote learning. There were some attempts to professionalize Jewish education. They didn't get very far. But after post-67, after the Six-Day War, teacher training programs improved. Jewish educators developed new educational techniques. I came to life Jewishly after the Six-Day War. There were informal Jewish experiences that began to proliferate, more summer camps. Hillel was reinvigorated. There was a new infatuation with Jewish culture, music, film, theater, literature. There was a growth of Jewish activism in which an entire generation of young Jews conspired to make sure that the world knew the plight of Soviet Jews. Decades later, those efforts came to fruition. And something that we never really think about, Jewish studies programs on college campuses. Before 1967, college students had very few academic opportunities to study Judaism. For many years, there were only 2 full-time professors of Jewish studies in America. Most people don't know this. There was Salo Baron at Columbia University and Harry Austen Wolfson at Harvard. That was it. That was it. After 1967, it seemed as if every college had Jewish studies classes. And then there were entire Jewish studies programs. If your kids or your grandkids are taking Jewish studies on the college campus or majoring in Jewish studies, that only happened after 1967. And there's a story to be told here. Do you know what caused Jewish studies to proliferate on college campuses? Black studies. We imitated what African Americans were doing. And then, of course, it became an entire school of minority studies, identity studies, etc. So, my friends, what I am saying to you is this. As dark as the present moment has been, I believe that there is the potential for hope and rebirth. I will say this as well. I believe that there is a potential for a new Jewish literature that will emerge. Rabbi Herber and I were talking about this. We believe that there will be a new Echa, a new book of Lamentations, a new scroll that will emerge out of October 7th and the aftermath. But I hope and I pray that those stories, that poetry, will not be dirges reminiscent of Lamentations or of Bialik or Holocaust poetry. Rather, I hope that that literature will be a recitation of the heroism, both military and spiritual, of ordinary people who came face to face with the demonic. I write these words and I speak these words now at Shloshim. I have been comforted and counseled by the cautionary, compassionate words of our tradition that say that mourners are exempt from their Jewish obligations. When your dead lies before you, you are patur, you are exempt from the mitzvot. It also cajoles would-be consolers not to make grandiose statements, to shelve their elegant theologies. I remind you that the worst thing about the book of Job is that Job's friends just didn't shut up. On the other hand, had they been silent, there would have been very little Job. But I'll say something in conclusion. The Hebrew word for crisis, and we are in a crisis, the deepest crisis of our lifetime. Hebrew word for crisis is mashper, and that contains the root shavar, which means broken. A crisis is when something is broken. But there's an amazing paradox. The word mashber means crisis. It contains the word shavar, to be broken. But it is also the word for birthing stool, upon which women in the ancient world would crouch in order to give birth. So from this we learn that while a crisis implies brokenness, a crisis is also, paradoxically and potentially, a moment of birth. These wretched, dark days for the Jewish people, let us confront the brokenness that must bear, but let us also hope that we are entering into another mashber, a birthing stool, and into a period of, to borrow the name of my new book, of tikkun ha'am, of repairing our people. Thank you very much. I will be happy to entertain questions. Again, a question usually ends with a question mark, not an alternate speech. Tell me your response. What did I miss? What did I overstate? What do you think? What do you think?
Raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you.
I didn't hear any mention about Brandeis University, especially pre and post 1967. Is that an exception to what you've said?
In what way would it be an exception?
They've had Jewish studies, was part of that. Didn't they have important, and still do have important Jewish study departments?
I don't think there was a major, though. Interesting thing about Brandeis University, a fun fact about Brandeis. Some of you must know this. What year did Brandeis get started? 1948. In fact, the first freshman class entered just several months after what happened. Exactly. Very interesting, right? In 1 year, within 6 months, two very different responses to what it means to be Jewish in the modern world. We have to create our own institution, and we have to create our own state. Isn't that interesting? Fascinating, I think. Okay, let's keep going.
How do you conceptualize what will happen?
How do I concept?
More specifically, how will we be renewed, if you will?
What tools do we use for that? I am not a prophet, neither am I the son of a prophet. I can only sketch in broad outline what I think could happen. On my better days, I think that we have the ability to do this. On my worst, more pessimistic days, I believe, and what I write in the book, is that many corners of non-orthodoxy have run out of steam. The argument that I make in the book is that we have to bring back obligation, we have to bring back a sense of communal responsibility, and we also, I think, need to reinvigorate even secular Jewish culture. I have chapters in the book on Bob Dylan, on Leonard Cohen, on Paul Simon, on Steven Spielberg. I believe that there are messages in secular Jewish culture that we could be using as well. So it's an unwritten story yet, and we're really still too much in shock from what has happened. I think there are possibilities. I hope I'm right.
I have a question about situation in universities. The creation of Jewish studies was great, and it continued for a long time. What's happened just recently is the Association for Jewish Studies put out a statement shortly after October 7th, which was so weak they had to apologize for it and issue a stronger statement. And there's a real problem within that body of intellectuals. It's not as bad, but it's similar to what's happening in the university in general, which is a lack of support for Israel and for the Jewish community. Can you see, I mean, this is sort of out of left field, but can you see where this might come from and what might be done about it?
The problem with what happens in Jewish studies, and I'm well aware of what happened with the AJS statement, and the fact that there are several key scholars who have withdrawn from AJS and may be starting a separate organization. The problem with Jewish studies is the problem of the academic world in general, which is that there has been an infestation of secular philosophical ideas into the Jewish world and into the intellectual world that have wound up being toxic. Now, please be careful. This is not the first time that has happened. We wouldn't have Maimonides without Maimonides interacting with the Muslim philosophical world, which itself was an interaction with the Greek philosophical world. Jewish thinkers for 2,000 years have always taken Judaism and have meshed it in with an overlay of the secular philosophical world. So Martin Buber was Judaism plus existentialism. Mordecai Kaplan was Judaism plus American pragmatism. This has always been the case. But what we have not seen is a nihilistic philosophical framework in which American Jewish studies professors are now forced to operate. On the one hand, shame on them. On the other hand, they have no choice. No one ever expected, or we should not have expected, Jewish studies on the college campus to be another form of ethnic pleading, by which I mean that if you're going to teach Jewish studies on the college campus, you have to do so in a scientific way, using every intellectual tool at your disposal. It's not supposed to be a B'nai B'rith lecture. I'm not being cute here. In other words, this is not merely ethnic cheerleading. The problem is that that intellectual mindset itself can be amoral and can chip away at what we are trying to do in the larger university sphere. You hear what I'm saying? It's a terrible paradox. Let me be clear. Let me be clear. If a professor of Jewish studies signs a statement and says, I believe in Israel because I believe in the covenant between God and Abraham as found in Parshas Lech Lecha, which I read in synagogue last week. That is not enough for you to lose your tenure, but it's academically a very flabby argument. You hear what I'm saying? You can't do it that way. He's a retired university professor. Okay. Of Jewish studies. Oh, gosh. Well, I should know. You know, what does it say here? Know before whom you stand. I should know before whom I stand. Do you agree? Have I said things that make sense to you?
Yeah, of course.
This was Jacob Neusner, Alav Shalom's great argument that the problem with Jewish studies on some college campuses had become another form of ethnic pleading. And he wanted it to be scientific and rigorous. And it should be scientific and rigorous. But when it brings in, and I'm going to use the term again, nihilistic worldviews, then it starts to become very problematic. Thank you. It's a privilege to meet you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm a bit of a liberal myself, but
Aren't we all?
But yesterday I heard you and the Imam make a comment about, and I wanted you to expand on it, if you would please, about Obama when he talked about Israel. He talked about Israel was set up as a response to the persecution of Jews in the Holocaust. And he didn't take it any further than that. And you suggested that it should go further. And I can kind of imagine in my mind what that means, but perhaps you can help me with some direction. A start for that conversation.
Of course.
Oh, yeah, he did. He said it was a mistake.
I'm happy to apologize for Abdullah.
No. Abdullah said that what the president did was a mistake.
Yes. Yeah, well, I'm happy to interpret what he said. I believe it is a mistake, but let us be honest. Before we jump all over President Obama for that statement that he made, we must be honest and self-critical. By a show of hands, please, friends. How many of you believe, have said that the state of Israel is at least partially a response to the Holocaust and was created as a way of bringing in the refugee? Why don't you just, yeah, right? How many of you believe that? How many of you have said that? He got that from us. Now, by the way, let me give you my own little take on Zionism here. I'm going to simplify Zionism so ridiculously and in such a vulgar way that I could be arrested for this. What President Obama was talking about was the Zionism, I love alliteration, of rescue. That's the Zionism of Herzl. That's the Zionism that says, I was present at the trial of Dreyfus. I saw the crowds in the streets screaming, "Death to the Jews." I come to the conclusion, says Herzl, that there is no future for the Jews of Europe. When you think about it, by the way, the real founder of political Zionism was not Theodor Herzl. It was the somewhat unknown editor of the newspaper in Vienna who sent him to Paris to cover the Dreyfus trial. Think about that. Herzl was a mediocre playwright, and he was actually the culture, I think he was the food critic for I'm not kidding you, I'm not being cute here, okay? So Herzl rescues his career from mediocrity and transforms the Jewish world. The Zionism of rescue is basically, some of you remember the song by the Animals. We gotta get out of this place. Sing it with me. If it's the last thing we ever do, we gotta get out of this place. Europe ain't no place to be a Jew. I just made that up. I'm not proud. That's what Obama was talking about. But over here, we have another R word, and that's the Zionism of resurrection, in which we resurrect a culture and we rebuild ourselves. That is the Zionism of Achad Ha'am. That's the Zionism of, I go into my favorite bookstore on Emek Raphaim, the main drag of the German colony. It's a hip bookstore. And there is the young woman who works there, Avigail. I've been doing business with her for the last couple of summers. She's no older than 22. She says to me in Hebrew, "Hey, do you know who Hillel Zeitlin is?" I said, "Yes, of course, the mystic who died not in Treblinka, in the labor camp on the way to Treblinka." She said, "Oh, I have a new collection of his essays. Here, you must read it. And here, read with me this essay on the Shekhinah." And I'm sitting there, and we're reading, and we're studying it together. Okay, this secular Jewish young woman, and I'm in tears. You get it? This is the resurrection of a culture. Ask yourselves, how many bookstores would you have to go to in America to have that kind of conversation on anything of literary merit? You think you're going to get that at Barnes & Noble? I don't think so. Actually, the way you will have those conversations, small local bookstores. That's where these things happen. And you and I probably know that, right? So if Obama got the idea that Zionism was the Zionism of rescue, it's because we've been teaching that for so long. Now, I quipped yesterday that on the one hand, that makes the Palestinians say, and why are we paying the price for this? If it happened over there, it was Isaac Deutscher who basically compared this to a people that jumps out of a burning building and lands on the back of other people who are running from a burning building. That is the Palestinian critique of Zionism. In other words, if you are being rescued, we didn't make this trouble. Oh, now, excuse me, I'm being possessed by a devil, okay? Okay, this is Billy Joel singing, right? We didn't start the fire. Right.
Now, it ignores the fact that there was massive fascist and Nazi influence in Arab literature and in the Arab world during and before World War II, okay? But it also ignores the fact that we have that second Zionism over here, the Zionism of resurrection of a culture, and paradoxically, this is really interesting. If you sit down with a Palestinian and you talk about the Zionism of culture, of wanting to rebirth ourselves in our land and replenish ourselves with the best of what's in us, believe it or not, you know what kind of response you might get? Agreement. Agreement. So thanks for asking that question. That's a very deep question, and I'm really grateful to you for helping all of us kind of think that out. Again, President Obama was using what he knew about Jewish history. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yes. Okay.
I've been distressed like many of us. I've been distressed like many of us about the betrayal, really, of the liberal progressive, and it's been coming for a while. But I am also impressed in a way. We've watched people, college professors, be funded to go to Middle East study, I believe paid for by Saudis, wherever the wealth is, among Arabs, to go and study and, produce scholarship. And I'm wondering how this has been so successful. I mean, anti-Semitism's perhaps, and hatred of Jews and love of victims may be part of the reason, but it's pretty widespread.
There has been, over decades, a subvention of academic programs by Saudi and wealthy Arab oil money, no question about it. And one of the sad things, we haven't talked at all, though I do have a podcast that will be coming out on this soon, on the failure of the liberal churches as well, the national bodies, mostly the Methodists and the Episcopal Church. And the story that doesn't get told enough is how much investment they have in Arab Christian communities, especially, by the way, in the West Bank and the Old City in Jerusalem. So it's a very murky story, and it's not a pretty one. Yes, financial and spiritual, yes, no question.
I hope you can hear me. What I would like to say is that we see that we've been abandoned by the liberal left. What I would like, and I teach in college, not UW, it's Bellevue College, which is a glorified community college, but it helps because it educates people who go to community colleges. And what I want to say is I wouldn't let those people who claim they are the liberal left, the progressive, appropriate progressiveness. In other words, they do not define me. I say that because I teach with these colleagues. I saw this coming a long time, this kind of anti-Semitism. I also want to add that in spring, like the last couple of springs, my class is over 75% Muslim. And the reason is that among my left liberal colleagues, I'm the only one who does not schedule anything on Eid al-Fitr. And when I tell my colleagues, don't schedule on the 12th, the 14th, the 15th of April, it's Eid al-Fitr, they ask me, what's that?
So
you can hear my anger.
yes, can you taught us a lot. Can you end with a question?
Yes. In other words, what are we to do to make it clear that we are not, if you feel that you're liberal, progressive, you've been expelled from the movement, how do you assert yourself and say, I will not allow you to expel me from the movement and to define
Thank you.
my politics.
Thank you. That's a really great question. I'm really glad you asked that. It's the first time I've been asked that question, and I'm honored to be able to do so in this sanctuary. I think we have to be very careful and self-defining. When I speak of my radical disappointment with the radical left, the progressive left, I'm talking about the radical left, the progressive left, the woke left. I am a liberal. I'm a classic liberal. I don't want to get involved in politics here, party politics, just suffice it to say, I am a classic, unreconstructed liberal. Now, I don't want to make a political statement here because the Jewish community has to be a very big tent. I believe that all kinds of political behaviors and voting patterns are legitimate and kosher among Jews. I can't imagine Jews voting for a fascist candidate, but they have in certain places. I'm not going to make any comments about particular presidential candidates here, seriously, because it's not my place to do so, and we all have a variety of opinions, okay? And I mipnei darchei shalom, in the interests of peace. I'm just not going there. That being said, this crisis might propel some Jewish leftists and liberals across the center line into conservatism. There is a record of this happening. That's what the neocons came into existence as a result of the Gulf War, as a result of the confrontation with Arab fascism in the form of Saddam Hussein. You understand what I'm saying? There is a historic record here of that happening. From my point of view, this is just me, this is just Jeff talking, I could be wrong. It would be a failure of nerve if we use this present moment as an excuse to completely negate what liberalism has brought to American Jews, Judaism, and America itself. I'm talking about small L liberalism. I once knew a woman in Atlanta who was so allergic to the word liberal. When she heard that, liberal Judaism, meaning non-Orthodox Judaism, she broke out in hives. Finally, I said to her, your granddaughter's going to college this year, right? I said, yes. She said, yes. So is she studying the non-conservative arts? Liberalism is a huge idea that made modernity. Free inquiry, rational conversation, human rights, right? These are things that all people agree with, even, by the way, conservatives. Let's not throw the ideological baby out with the bathwater. By the same token, let me be very careful and very, very nuanced. My quibbles with the academic left and the various philosophical academic packaging that has led to the destruction of the relationship between Jews and the academy on the left should not be interpreted as Jews will abandon the university. I think that it would be disastrous for us to flirt with an anti-intellectualism in this country that's already very present. So that's a very important idea. In other words, this brings me back to one of my big ideas that I write about in my new book, Tikkun Ha'am, Repairing Our People, Israel and the Crisis of Liberal Judaism, which will be out in January. And by the way, within a few weeks or so, there will be an Amazon landing page for it. One of my big ideas in this book is that Jews need to be a critical element in culture. Our job is to be the moral critics of every society in which we live. You got that? So we have to make sure that society doesn't simply go down the rabbit hole and want to trash academics totally. I've always said to people, listen to me, when they're talking about the elitists out there, the elitists in Hollywood, who are they talking about? The Jews. They're talking about us. We're those people. We shouldn't be buying into that. And that also goes to my second point that I made yesterday, and I continue to make. In a huge political atmosphere and cultural atmosphere in this country, it is always incumbent on people to criticize the people on their side. You've got to criticize, love your neighbor as yourself actually might mean you got to talk to the person who is your ideological proximate, okay? And you've got to critique that person. I can't fix the Republican Party. It's not my playground. I need Republicans to do that, okay? My job, again, as someone who is a registered Democrat, is to speak to the Democratic Party, all right? You need to keep your own people honest. That is also why, by the way, as a Reform rabbi, when people ask me, are you going to criticize what's happening in Orthodoxy and the conservative movement and stuff like that? I don't go there. It's not my job. Not my job. I have enough problems with my own movement. Seriously. And I'm not being cute. And I'm not being lazy. Okay? Rabbi Herber, his job is to criticize the conservative movement. I got my hands full with Reform Judaism right now. And I'm glad that there are critics of Orthodoxy out there. It's not my thing, certainly as a writer, to score points. Now, I have criticized the Hasidim in Brooklyn and in upstate New York who have created sociological conditions that have created a horrific educational system for their children. I've gone after them in print, but that's an emergency, okay? It's not up to me to criticize their theology. So we have to keep each other honest. That's the point. I think there's another hand over here. How much time we got, Rabbi? I'm just warming up.
This is going to be the last question. Right. The last word.
The very last. This is the Mayim Achronim. This is the last water.
Rabbi Salkin, I've really enjoyed everything, and I apologize for my question. In view of the opinions that you have expressed over the wide diversity among American Jews, do you think that the American Jewish population or the American Jewish voice has been remiss or wrong in making no distinction between the existence of, supporting the existence of the state of Israel and supporting blindly the government of the day? Do we lose credibility in the eyes of the rest of the American population? And I'm not talking about the current administration only. We could go right back to 1948 if you want.
That's a really good question, and it's a wonderful note on which to end. And there was no reason to apologize for that. That's a wonderful question and a very deep one, and it's a question that keeps me awake at night. And how dare you? Look, I think it's really important for us to make some basic distinctions here. How many of you are loyal citizens of America? Don't ask me to define loyal. How many of you would consider yourselves to be patriotic Americans? Okay. Lump in your throat on the 4th of July, lump in your throat when you attempt to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. I say attempt. The range of that song is like an octave and a half. But, you know, ever notice something about the Star-Spangled Banner? Read the lyrics. Do you know that entire song is one run-on question? It's a series of questions. How many of you don't have to raise your hand, but just nod your heads internally. How many of you have had quibbles with any president of the United States who has been in office in your conscious lifetime? All right, good. I feel the same way about Israel. I am not an Israeli citizen, but I am a patriot vis-a-vis the state of Israel. When I go into Rabbi Herber's office and I see his wonderful little figurines of Israeli prime ministers and statespeople, I note with a twinkle in my eye that even knowing his politics, he did not curate that collection according to who was Likud, who was Labor, right? He's got them all there. That's a wonderful metaphor for how I feel about Israel. I do not predicate my support of Israel on the support of any particular administration, and my trudging up the hills for 2 Saturday nights in Jerusalem to the demonstrations bears witness to that. Now, let me just quibble a little bit with what you said. I've always believed that it's my job as a Jewish spokesperson and rabbi to, outside the gates of my community, interpret Israel's actions in the best possible way that I can. I don't believe it's necessarily our job to, again, as a PR move, to criticize the current Israeli government, though I have, and have written letters to the newspaper in which I've done that. Because I don't believe that we win ourselves any points for doing so. The quibble I have with your question is implicit in the question is that we lose moral credibility by not coming out against the government of Israel. But no one ever appointed American Jews as representatives of the state of Israel that has to defend, or for that matter, not defend those governments. Here's what I've come to understand, and I'll close on this particular note. I think for us to not stand up for Israel in its moment of need is a failure of nerve and a failure of pride. I will also say something else. Even our shaky coalition partners on the left and the progressive left and in various communities and various faith communities would expect no less of us, and I will now say this, would snicker at us behind our backs if they saw us dissing our own community and our own people. It is a matter of pride. And I think it is incumbent on us to say to our partners, you failed us. I'll end with the following Hasidic story. A rabbi was talking to a disciple and he said, let me ask you something, do you love me? And the disciple said, of course I love you. The rabbi asked him, do you know what causes me pain? And the disciple says, how can I know what causes you pain? To which the rabbi replied, if you do not know what causes me pain, how can you say that you love me? Our relationships require that we hold each other responsible. And we have walked the walk and we have talked the talk in those circles for the last 80 years in this country. I will say something about the anti-Semitism that comes from the radical left. It was always there. That's Karl Marx. That's communism. That is the USSR, which manufactured the Zionism is racism myth at the United Nations. It was always there. It's not that we failed to see it. It wasn't hip for us to call it out. As I wrote in a recent article, it's what I call the Che Guevara syndrome. Che Guevara was a thug. We had his poster on our walls when we were teenagers. He was dashing and good-looking. He was a romantic hero, but he was a murderer. And the Cubans trained the members of the PLO in terrorism, which means that Castro and Che Guevara and other Cuban revolutionaries had the blood of our children on their hands. We failed to call it out. We're not feeling that way again. You've all been a blessing. Thank you so much.
Many, many thanks to Rabbi Salkin, especially pinch hitting this morning. And next time you're here, God willing, there will be no mashpir, there will be no crisis, and we'll be able to enjoy your Torah in its fullest. Thanks so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Marvin, do you remember what the first few words of the Torah reading are? I know. Is it Vayikach ha'ever? Sorry, is it here?
It's Shlishi. Yes,
It is,
Vayikach.
right? Okay.